I'm working in VS Code using their SSH Remote Development extension, and I'm having a problem where I can initially connect to the server, but as I'm working, the connection is failing, and I'm continually seeing these pop-up messages about attempting to reconnect, or this notification about trying to initialize VS Code on the server. And in my experience, this typically happens when I'm working on a budget server that doesn't have a lot of RAM, because the remote development extension is very resource intensive. So what I find is it's actually maxing out the RAM on the server to the point where it causes the server to lock up, and then you end up in this reconnection loop. To address this, I'm going to show how to get past this problem once it occurs, and then also how to prevent it from happening in the future. So the first thing you want to do is close VS Code so it stops trying to connect to the server. And then you can open up a command line program and try to SSH into your server. In my situation, though, the server is so locked up that even this doesn't work. So I've got to find a different way to access the server because I need to reboot it to get it out of this locked up state. The way I'm going to do that is via my server provider's control panel. So here's that control panel for the server I'm using in this demo. My server provider is DigitalOcean. And I just want to look through my settings and find some way to reboot the server. And of course, this is going to vary depending on your server provider, but in the case of DigitalOcean, I'm going to do that by toggling the server off and then back on again. While that's shutting down, I just want to highlight, if we look down at the CPU usage chart for the server, you can see all these spikes occurring where it's even going over 100%. And that's just showing where that VS Code Remote Dev extension was maxing out the server, causing that lockup to occur. Anyway, let's check back in on our reboot. Looks like the server's off, so I'm going to turn it back on. And with that resolved, let's talk about how to prevent this from happening in the future. The best thing you could do is increase the RAM on your server. But if cost is an issue, another thing you could do is enable something called swap space. This will make it so that if your server runs out of RAM, it will use a portion of the server's hard drive as basically backup RAM. Now, this isn't as optimal as true RAM, which is why ideally you could just upgrade your server. But in my experience, it is enough to get things working smoothly if you are working on a budget server and do want to do VS Code remote development. So let's run through how to set up swap space. To do this, I'm going to go over to the notes that accompany this video and go down to the section Enable Swap Space. There's a series of commands we can run. Now, I'm not going to try to open VS Code and connect to the server to run these commands because I'm going to run into the same lockout issue. So I'm going to go back to my command line program and just regular SSH into the server. And you can see it did successfully connect that time because I had rebooted the server. So let's run through these commands. The first thing we're going to do is create a swap file. Next, we need to set the permissions to that swap file to 600. And then we're going to instruct our server to set up the swap space using that file. And then finally, we're going to enable it. Now, this is something we want to always be enabled even after we reboot our server. And to make that happen, we're going to add this config line to our file system's table file. So again, we're going to copy and run that command. And then I have a command here if we want to confirm that it worked. We're going to run swap on show. And you should see output like this. With swap enabled, let's go back to VS Code. And I'm going to prompt it to connect to my server. And just to test things out, I'm going to open up a directory in my File Explorer. Within this directory, I will create a new file, make some changes to that file, save those changes, open up the source control panel. Basically, I'm just trying to use VS Code like I usually would to put it through its paces and see if it locks up at all. And as you can see, everything is working smoothly. So it looks like we're good to go. All right, so hopefully this was helpful to you if you're working on a budget server and having any sort of issues connecting to that server from VS Code.